Welcome to It's Bloody Complicated, the Compass podcast. I'm Neil Lawson, your host and director of Compass. Joining me to help manage the questions is Grace Barnett from the Compass office. Hello, Grace.
Hello.
These are unprecedented times, and we need to rise to the new and enormous challenges we now face. Over the next few weeks, we'll be speaking with writers, thinkers, politicians, journalists, and public service workers about how we come out of this mess in much better shape than we went in. A good society after COVID-19. These conversations have live access for Compass members who can put their own questions directly to our guests. If you'd like to participate in a live call and help support all of our work, go to compassonline.org.uk/podcast to join Compass today. Otherwise, sit back, relax, and enjoy this week's podcast. The virus impacts on everyone, but it impacts on them differently. Joining us this week to discuss the crisis and how we build back better from it is Miatta Fahnbulleh, who's the Chief Executive of NEF, the New Economics Foundation. Miatta appears regularly and brilliantly in the media, and more recently has been a co-conspirator with Compass and others to help set up Build Back Better, which was launched yesterday. So this is really timely. So, Miatta, it's great to have you on the call tonight. Thanks so much for being part of this. Tell us two things. Tell us where you are and tell us how you are.
I'm in southeast London at home with my children screaming in the background, so I hope you can't hear them. And I'm good. I'm really good. I'm excited about the momentum we're building around Build Back Better. I'm excited about the sort of collaboration and coordination that's happening, but it's hard work, so I'm also a little bit tired.
Yeah, good. You always seem, I don't know you that well, but you always seem very bright and very bubbly and very positive, which kind of accords with Compass optimism. So it's good to be in your orbit. So do you want to just help us locate you and your political life and about why you've ended up being the chief executive of NEF? What's driven you? What other jobs have you had that are relevant so people can kind of understand you and where you've come from?
Yeah, so I mean, I've always been pretty motivated to work in public policy. I think I was very clear. I'm born in Liberia, grew up in part in Sierra Leone, fled when we had a civil war. So social justice is something that's been kind of baked into my DNA, and I was always clear that I wanted to go into jobs that I was doing good and public good. So I actually started in international development, then moved into work in the civil service in the cabinet office in what used to be called the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit when Prime Ministers wanted strategy back in the day. I spent about 8 years working on lots of different areas, and actually was there through Blair, through Brown, through the start of the Cameron years. And I think the coalition years were interesting for me because, I got to lead and work on the work the government was doing on devolution, on localism, on, the first incarnation of city deals. So this was all stuff I was passionate about, but I struggled with the wider agenda around austerity. I struggled with the politics of it. And I think that was a point at which I decided that as much as I loved working in the service and working for the public good, I wasn't sufficiently politically neutral to stay in the service. So I went and worked for Ed Miliband when he was the leader of the opposition as his head of sustainable communities. So covering everything from energy and climate change policy through to transport, local government policy, a massive brief, but a fantastic brief to be doing. And then after 2015, I worked a little bit with local government, moved on to the Institute for Public Policy Research, where I was Director of Research, and then got the chance to come and work at NEF. And for me, NEF is an exciting organisation that kind of brings all the different aspects of my politics together. And the thing that always frustrated me in the civil service is I'm like, don't do something if you're not going to do it properly to drive proper change. Incrementalism was never something that sat easy with me. And what I love about NEF is the yearning for transformative change. So it's sort of been a natural path to get me here.
And how long have you been at NEF, and what's the plans there? Because it's an organisation with a great history. It's done a lot of great things. I feel it's kind of beginning to move again now and find its place. I mean, we'll get into the politics of that a bit more in a minute. But what are the plans for NEF?
Yes, I've been there for about 2.5 years, and it's been, I mean, it's gone by like a flash, and yet there's been so much. I think the thing that struck me when I went to NEF was it's an amazing organization, amazing people, has this incredible legacy. You know, the way that someone described NEF to me was, you know, NEF was the organization that came up with ideas that in 10 years' time became the mainstream. Which is quite a kind of legacy to have. And it's always been clear about its mission to transform the economy so it works for people and planet. It's always been clear about the need to not just have ideas, but to also work in communities and places with people to try and affect change and make practice and make the new economy feel real now, so that that becomes a springboard for the bigger change. But when I sort of took over, my sense is that actually a lot of what NEF had been talking about for a long time always felt like it was in the margins of where our mainstream was. And I sort of came at a time when the mainstream was catching up with the things that NEF had been saying. There was a sense that the economy is not working for people. And then the planet bit followed very quickly over the course of the last year and a bit. And my big thing was, it feels like we have a moment where things like the climate crisis, where you know, against the backdrop of a decade in which living standards had been stagnant, all of these things were coming together and creating a sense of change that felt like it fitted with NEF's agenda. But what was missing for me was a clear sense of the route map, like what's the alternative to what we have if we don't like it, and how do we get from where we are now to where we want to get to. And that's been the focus of the work I've been trying to do at NEF, getting us to focus on the how. You know, what is the alternative we're trying to create? Can we articulate that? Can we get people to galvanize around it? And then how on earth do we get from where we are now to where we need to get to? And what's the prospectus that allows us to do that?
So let's do, in terms of the politics of that, I mean, NEF was seen to be pretty close to the Corbyn project. And so what have you learned from that experience, and what do we have to learn from, you know, the successes and the failures of that project, the obvious electoral failures of that project, and where do we think we are with the new Labour leadership?
Yeah, so it's really interesting because, you know, NEF for a really long time wasn't political. You know, other think tanks got involved in the political sphere. NEF always stood away from it, and for us, it was always about trying to chart what the kind of the next thing was, the next system, the next project. And I think the thing that became quite interesting was, we didn't find the Corbyn project found us. And, you know, ideas that we had long been pushing for, from a shorter working week through to a Green New Deal, all of that stuff, you know, the leadership seemed to embrace. John McDonnell in particular, you know, I think drew a lot from our ideas. And so, you know, the thing I always keep saying is that, you know, we're not politically aligned, we're a charity. We've got values, we've got a bent, but we never sought that project. In some respects, they kind of recognized the opportunity in some of the ideas that we were prosecuting. I think the lesson from it that we certainly took was ideas are not enough. And, you know, you can have all the ideas you want about the change that we need to affect, unless you can root those ideas in people and communities, unless you can create a movement behind those ideas, it only goes so far. And part of, I think, the challenge in the last election was, yes, people didn't believe the prospectus because there was too much baked into it. But there wasn't a popular movement that was kind of playing back some of those ideas. And so one of the jobs for us is, you know, it's not enough for us to just chuck out ideas into the ether. And if you like, use the old model the think tanks use, if you throw ideas, you do advocacy, you try and land things. We've got to try to work with alliances. We've got to try and work with movements in order to create popular pressure for some of these ideas, because big change won't and can't come from pressure from the top. You've got to have both pressure from below and, you know, appetite for change at the top as well.
Yeah, well, we call that 45-degree change, which is emerging bottom up, and then how does that link up to the vertical state? I mean, I guess on that, I would sort of say, I mean, the Corbyn did have momentum. It did have a big party membership. It did have kind of the anti-war movement and the climate change movement and the youth strikers, and there was quite a lot of energy there. And it kind of, what worries me, I have to say, is that where are the kind of movements around Starmer and the Labour Party? I mean, if Corbynism didn't have enough of that, surely Starmer, who is much more professional and much more electable, doesn't have that either, does he? Or not yet, anyway.
So, I mean, I think there's sort of two parts to it for me. I think, yes, there was a movement, a young, vibrant, dynamic movement around the Corbyn project, but it was still a kind of urban youth movement. And actually, one of the shocks was a sort of shift in the red wall areas. And I think there were parts of the traditional Labour movement that weren't part of this, that weren't feeling the love. And so, yes, there was a movement, but it wasn't deep enough. It wasn't wide enough. It wasn't diverse enough. And it didn't root itself in the communities that we need to root ourselves in. And I think that's a big lesson that Labour need to take and the Labour leadership need to take. I mean, I think it's early days for the Starmer project, if you like. And I think they're still trying to establish themselves. The thing that we keep saying is, whatever you do, do not lose sight of the need for transformative change, because, like, you know, all of our assessments suggest that the public are there. They might not like the, you know, change scares people, but there is a sense that we are hitting a tipping point and we can't continue doing the things that we've been doing before. And to retreat from ambitious transformative change would be completely the wrong thing to do, not least when you've got the Prime Minister aping, you know, Roosevelt and talking about the New Deal and all of that. To retreat into small-scale, incremental, technocratic type of politics and policy would be a massive mistake. And I think if they can locate their politics in the need for radical change, there is a movement out there that can galvanize around it. I think if they retreat from that, actually they not only risk that movement moving on to something else, but they actually risk being eclipsed by the current government, which would be quite some feat.
And just one specific on that. I mean, and I think this is a really tough, you know, part of the project. But what's going to unite the metropolitan and the red wall places? I mean, it's a real. I mean, I've not known a time when that kind of split feels as strong culturally. But we have to do it, don't we? We have to find a language, a narrative, and a set of policies which are going to speak to both of the, you know, the cities and the towns, the cosmopolitan, the communitarian, etc. I mean, you know, where's NEF on that stuff, and how are you thinking about that stuff?
Yeah, I mean, look, and that's the $1 million question. For me, and I would say this, I generally think that there is a project around living standards and an economy that doesn't work. You know, the thing that I think was right with the Corbyn project is that they got the problem analysis. You know, there is a sense that people have that it's just not working for them, and that unites you know, different classes, it unites different parts of the country. So there is a coalition that can be built around that. But I think we need a way to talk about it that doesn't alienate, that doesn't exclude. And until we get that right, it's quite hard to forge that. But, you know, if there wasn't the scope for that alliance before, which I generally think there was, against the backdrop of everything from wage stagnation through to, you know, living standards that hadn't moved since 2008. If there wasn't the scope, my goodness, coronavirus and the economic fallout will be creating the scope. But the question of the economy, who it's working for, hardship, and how on earth we ensure that we can rise out of this in a way that maintains living standards will be the question that will define the next 10 years. And the party that can get that right and have the right story to tell and show that they have some answers is the party that will succeed. But this is the thing that will be defining our politics for the next 10 years.
People start loading up any questions in the chat thing, because I've got a couple more questions before we switch over to you. So let's, it's really, I'm smiling because no one mentions Brexit anymore. It's so funny, isn't it, that it's kind of gone off of the agenda. Let's go to another B, or three Bs, the Build Back Better, which that we launched between us and others yesterday. Why is it needed?
Well, I think it's desperately needed because we had a lot of these problems in our economy for a long time. Inequality, the squeeze in living standards, the climate emergency. So there was all of this stuff brewing anyway that in my view would have led to a crisis moment. And I think what the pandemic has done is shine a massive spotlight on all of that. And things that we'd swept underneath the carpet, you know, the fact that key workers who are critical to our economy were being paid absolutely nothing, the fact that we had endemic inequality, the fact that we had families that were working and yet living in poverty, all of that stuff had been kind of, you know, some of us were shouting about it constantly, but I don't think there was a laser focus on it. And I think the pandemic has sort of exposed all of that. And it's really shifted the mind frame, the narrative. And I think it doesn't matter whether you're coming from the left or the right. There's a sense that it has to be a turning point. And so for me, the importance of Build Back Better is that, yes, we can recover from this eventually. It's going to be pretty tough, but we can recover. We can't recover back to where we had before. You know, we've got to recover in a way. These moments of profound trauma create the opportunity for us to build back better. And it feels like the politics are lining around that. You know, the polling that we did together showed that only 6% of the public don't want change. And generally the public, you know, are nervous of change, but I think that is instrumental. There is a sense that something has got to change. And there are always these pivotal moments in our history, the Great Depression, world wars, that create a turning point in the social settlement. And, you know, the window is, as awful as this pandemic is, it creates a turning point. And the question is, what does Build Back Better mean? And how do we define it in terms that it feels meaningful?
We can tell us a bit more about how that feels for you, but I always think that any of these moments when we demand other people change, that we also have to demand that we change ourselves. And I think, you know, the process of putting that coalition together, even writing the statement, I can't remember how many different versions we've had of that statement. But collaboration is the only way that we're going to have that kind of transformative politics. But it's really hard, isn't it? It's really difficult. I mean, how did you feel about that? I mean, you know, we've all been involved in different coalitions. It's probably one of the biggest ones that we've probably done, isn't it? It's really hard to do, isn't it?
It's incredibly hard. And, you know, it was funny because, you know, the statement, and if people haven't read it and signed up to it, please read it, sign up to it. But, you know, I looked at it and like, why would you not? Like, who wouldn't agree with this? Who wouldn't want to sign up to it straight away? And yet it was hard graft getting that kind of, that diversity of organizations around it. And there is something about the moment that I think demands all organizations to kind of, you know, work across organizational boundaries, work differently, make compromises, be tactical. And that was the thing that we were living and breathing in that process. And it's hard work, but I generally think that there is a moment in time, you know, if not now, then when? If not now to say, you know, let's put aside what territory is or organizational priorities to fight for the things that we can win, then when? And the biggest risk at these moments is that, you know, the voices calling for change, the voices calling for, you know, progressive solutions are fragmented, you know, so we just create noise. We create noise that doesn't translate into power, that then doesn't translate into change. And if ever there was a moment for all of us to work in the collective interest of change and to be humble and pragmatic and tactical, it is now.
And so, I agree wholeheartedly, and I think that trying to learn how progressives and others work in that kind of dispersed way. How do you end up with a sum that's greater than the parts is an art? You know, that's why I was more interested in that through the process of doing the Build Back Better thing than I was necessarily with the outcome. And I think we all have to learn that culture and that art of collaboration, you know, compromise, not to end up in the soggy centre, but to learn from other people and to share and to develop new and different analysis, etc. So I think it's certainly been useful for me in that, you know, the process has been useful. So what comes next in terms of, you know, so we've got this kind of umbrella, we've got this hashtag. What do we need to do collectively? But what are NEF going to do in terms of beginning to flesh out the concept of what Build Back Better means?
Yeah. So for me, I think one of the most important things that the statement did was not just to kind of, you know, locate the ambition to build back better, which is really important, but was try and frame it around, the need for us to provide protections through world resource, public services, housing, I'd add social security within that, the need for us to tackle inequality between people and places, the need for us to create, well-paid, rewarding jobs, particularly against the backdrop of unemployment levels that we haven't seen for 25 years. And then critically, the need for us to prepare in a way that we did not prepare for this pandemic, for, I would argue, the bigger crisis that's upon us for climate change. And organizations from the CBI through to the trade unions, through to your Trust Shelter, like a big coalition, over 35 organizations, has essentially said, yes, these principles feel right. And I think that's really important because, I think it's great. It's absolutely great that the Prime Minister today said he wanted to build back better, that he wanted a new deal. It's almost like he'd literally nicked the stuff off us. But the point of danger is you talk the talk, but actually the substance just doesn't match up. And I think it's really important, particularly, 5 billion of infrastructure. Okay, well, that's a start, tiny little start, but actually, where is the recovery plan that deals with public services, inequality, jobs, planet? And we've got a framework. And if we can coalesce people around this framework when they're thinking about their demands and their campaigns and their pressure, we have a chance of framing this in a way that means that if you are saying you want to build back better and you're serious about it, there are some things that you're held to. In terms of the work that we want to do at NEF, we are a sort of think and do tank. So our currency are ideas. And actually trying to solve some of this, I think, requires new thinking, because I think some of our, we've always tried to do radical thinking, but even for us, we have to recalibrate against the current context. And so thinking about what are the responses that would allow us to not just deal with the deepest recession for 300 years, but to deal with them in a way that reconfigures our economy for the better. And so we are kicking off quite a big policy program, working with the groups of organizations that are going to be trying to do coordinated campaign around Build Back Better, to essentially try and build some alliances around a policy prospectus. We think that there are some things that are absolutely key coming out of this, where there feels like there's public appetite for us to do some quite ambitious and radical things. And that goes from the green recovery through to social care, which has got to be addressed coming out of this, through to work and pay in the context where people say, actually, we have to ensure that people who we value because they're doing key work are recorded. I scream from a child.
You can hear them all. Yeah, children. We're phoning Childline as you speak, Miatta.
So there are some areas where we think it's kind of rife territory for us to possibly land some change. So we want to try and do some hard graft policy thinking about what that looks like, but to try to do that with alliances and see whether we can come to some shared demands and objectives, and then try and work in a coordinated way to build pressure for that.
So the final bit from me before we switch over to everyone else and get some proper questions is what do we think about this in the context of quite an unpalatable Conservative government, who are going to be there for 4 years, whatever happens, and people get excited about Dominic Cummings and is the Prime Minister going to last? The Conservatives are going to be in office unless there's a disaster that no one's seen for 4 years. So what is our relationship to that government? How do we kind of think about competing electorally, but to cooperate intellectually? And my mind goes back to, I don't know what Keynes thought in 36 when he wrote the General Theory, or Beveridge in 42 when he wrote his report. I mean, that they didn't have supportive governments around them as we don't have now. Kind of, what do we think about the theory of change to try and get some of this stuff that has to be on the agenda quickly? We can't wait for 4 years. I mean, how do we approach that as progressives? What's the practice? Emotionally, how do we do that? And I guess practically, how do we do that?
Yeah, so look, for me, I think there are two opportunities. I think the first is, it's strange, we have a government that's not particularly ideological, and actually are driven more by politics than ideology of left or right or anything, and actually have shown that they are willing to take unprecedented action. They're willing to do things that, quite frankly, have surprised me in response to kind of moments. And I think they are ruthless about the politics, and there's an opportunity in that. So, you know, for us, you know, the theory of change is we actually think there's a space for consensus. And you know, NEF were always clear we will be pushing for a radical agenda, but at this moment in time, I think there is a new common sense that if we can lock in that new common sense, that creates a baseline against which we can then build and try and kind of push for more radical change. But if we get to a world where we say, actually, it's absolutely right that we have, you know, a social safety net through properly funded public services, where we expand the remit of what we call universal basic services that encompasses stuff like social care and childcare and properly funded social security, where we say that actually it is a mission of us to tackle inequality between people and places, and there's coordinated action to try and do that, and where we are serious about the challenge of climate change. If we lock that in as a point of consensus, so it kind of doesn't matter who is in government, that is just taken as a baseline. That was what was achieved after World War II, when we had that social settlement, that it didn't matter where your politics was, there was just something that we had locked in. Then I think that would be a massive win, because we can then build on that, and we can push further for some of the other things that we want to achieve. And it does feel like, partly because this government is so driven by the politics, that if you can shift public opinion, and actually public opinion doesn't require that much shifting, because all the polling suggests the public are more progressive and ambitious than our politicians have been. So when we're polling things, you know, from the shorter working week through to, you know, universal basic income, through to you know, public ownership of things, the public are there in resounding numbers. If you can galvanize that around a sense that change needs to happen, and you can get the public playing back to the politicians what their demands are, I think you've got a government that is driven by politics, that is driven by polling, and they will respond because first and foremost, they want to win, and particularly they want to win those red wall seats again. And so the theory of change is, how do you mobilize public opinion around a transformative agenda at a moment where, you know, external factors, the scale of the economic crisis, will make that feel like a no-brainer. And if you can do that, I think even with a Conservative government, we lock in some things. We lock them as the new social settlement, that it doesn't matter if you're right or left or whatever, you're on it. And then we build from that. And, you know, and if it does the job of essentially, you know, moving the common sense onto the territory of the left, if you want to see it in those terms. But for me, that's the win. If we can get out of, you know, in 4 years' time, no one is talking about austerity. Everyone accepts that you've got to invest. Everyone accepts that there is an interventionist role for the state to tackle things like inequality. Everyone accepts that we need a radical program to green our economy incredibly quickly. And we've got a package of universal basic services that no one questions. That would be a massive win.
Hello, this is Grace from the Compass office, interrupting for a moment. I'm lucky enough to come from a large and politically diverse family. We really did have the full political spectrum represented over Christmas dinner, but in spite of our differences, we still actually like each other. I've always known, because of this, that politics should be more about listening and learning from the people we disagree with than shouting at them and fighting with them. And of course, I've definitely known for a long time that it really is bloody complicated. So I was so happy that when one day I discovered Compass, quite by accident, through their brilliant work on the Progressive Alliance in the 2017 general election. Since then, it's been an absolute pleasure to once again be part of a political family where talking to people in different political parties, admitting that you alone don't have all the answers, is not just okay, but actively encouraged. So if you'd like to find out more about Compass, you can visit compassonline.org.uk. And now, back to the conversation.
Over to you, Grace, to start getting the questions from the people on the call.
All right, okay. Let's start with Peter Garbett, who has a question that follows on quite nicely from what you were just saying, Miatta. Peter.
Right, so I've got a question because I think the media played an incredibly huge role certainly in the last election, and probably in many of the elections before. They recognised that the policies that Labour were promoting were fairly popular, but because they're owned by the 1%, and because the 1% are scared that the structures that maintain the 1% as the 1% were under attack, they felt the need to destroy Corbyn rather than go for the policies, because the policies were, so popular. And I think that as long as anyone is putting forward policies, the ones you're putting forward at the moment, Miatta, are absolutely, perfect as far as I'm concerned. But as long as anyone's putting forward those policies, they will see that as a threat to their power structures, and they will use the media to attack whoever's leading that particular fight. That's my fear. Do you share that fear? If so, how do we counter that? Because the media is, covers everything really, TV, print media, even online.
Yeah, so I think that's a really good question, and the media are a problem. And my take on it is, I don't think it's even a kind of baked-in institutional backing for the 1%. I think there is a dominant narrative that has existed for a very long time, and the media still buy into that. So, the question, if I'm ever asked in an interview, I know they'll say, well, how do we pay for all of this? Or can we afford all of this? There are just certain things that have been baked into our public discourse, and that frames the way that the media approach it. Where I'm hopeful is, firstly, actually the diversity of other media outlets creates the space for us to engage the public directly. And actually the power of, back in the day, the tabloids, the Telegraph, like the core media outlets had such a grip on our public discourse. That doesn't happen now, because actually most people don't read them. People barely engage with the news, and they're getting their information from different channels. I think we've got to be smart and creative about how we engage those different channels. And my sense is that when the public discourse, it's question chicken and egg, but as the public discourse starts to shift, the media also starts to shift. So I found the last 18 months absolutely fascinating, and fine, we've had an absolutely unprecedented event that's taken place and shift that, but all the framing around the sorts of interventions that are being had and made, no one is challenging them. And that's an opportunity for us, because you can never again tell us this is too ambitious. You can never again tell us you can't afford to do this. You can never again tell us any of these things, because we've had them and no one pushed back. And yes, they'll say there's a moment of crisis. And our argument was always, we're calling for radical things, not because we're idle, it's because we think we are in crisis. I'm sorry, climate change is a crisis. A living standard stagnating is a crisis. The economic system isn't working. And it's not as visceral as this moment in time, but we were calling for radical things because we had something that was fundamentally broken. And so the moment of opportunity for me is, the old rule book has been torn up in this moment. The pandemic and the responses has torn up the old rule book. So there is a space for us to both start redefining the narrative as well as redesigning the rule book. And I think that's our counter to the media narrative. And I think if we can win that and win the public debate and use all other channels, there's an opportunity for us to bake that in. But we've also got to be, we've also got to recognize the fact, in the end, if you think about the established outlets, Mail, Telegraph, they're just more papers, particularly print media, that are going to be supportive of a right-leaning government, and they are going to be a left-leaning government, no matter who is in charge of that left-leaning government or opposition party. But that's always been the case, from Blair through to Brown, doesn't matter, through to Corbyn. That has always been the case. But we have more avenues to influence public opinion and debate than we did before.
Okay, thank you. Next question. We had quite a few people asking about devolution. Terry.
Yes, hello. Thank you for the chance to come in. I'm just thinking back to what you were saying about the challenge of bringing together red wall voters and conventional Labour voters and the new, young and radical voters that Corbyn attracted. And I'm just thinking about the fact that take back control seems to have resonated as a Brexit slogan. So would devolving power to local communities be one way of uniting the disparate voters, maybe?
100%. So, I'm desperately biased because I'm a hardcore localist and believe in community power. And I do in part because I've worked at the heart of government. And the insight I took from working at the heart of government is even where you have well-meaning governments and officials, you are just too far removed from the reality in places and in people's lives to make the right decisions. And you try and you do the analysis and you'll do polling or you'll do consultation, but you just can't. You can't because you just don't know and you're not close enough. And there's a reason why so many of our policy interventions and so many of the initiatives that are announced by ministers don't translate into meaningful change because there's a disconnection from what needs to happen in places on the ground with communities. So I am quite clear that our current political system is bust insofar it is far too centralized. And people are reacting against that. The reason why Take Back Control resonated so powerfully is that people feel angry at a system that's not working for them and then alienated from the levers of power to change that. And if you can start to shift power closer to people, and whether you do that by locating power directly with people, there are lots of different mechanisms in which you can do it, or you do it by locating power in elected representatives that are a bit closer. I know, my councillor, he lives 2 doors from me. I can go and shout at him if he hasn't got something right. And there's more kind of power and agency in that. I think that's a really important part of rebuilding our politics. And on that, I oscillate between feeling very optimistic and not, because we have these moments where it feels like there's momentum around the desire for devolution, and then, the normal instincts kick in. I was in government at the time when we were, taking big pushes to try and drive devolution, and it was hard fought, and I had to fight departments on every front, just to extract whatever power we could do for places that we were working with. So it is tough and hard won, but until we get that right, I think there is a big disjuncture between a big break between people and the people who are there to lead and represent them, and that is a massive problem. And so I think devolution has to be part of this. And for me, that is, yes, about power and responsibilities, but it's about money. Because if we had massive fiscal devolution, for example, places wouldn't have to look to Whitehall. They could tell Whitehall to take a jump and just do what it is that they needed to do for their communities. And so, in all of this, we can't and we shouldn't lose sight of that. And one of my worries is, those of us calling to build back better, we can build back better, but we can do it through quite a top-down, centralized approach. And I think that would be a mistake. So for those of us that are passionate about localism and devolution and the power of communities, we've got to fight to make sure that that is part of the project.
Thanks. Okay, next question from Kieran.
So my question was really about, as Neil said, we seem to be at a critical juncture. There does seem to be the mood in the country for what you might call a Green New Deal. But we also know that in order to do that, we probably do need a progressive alliance. And we also know that's incredibly difficult. So let's leave the Conservative Party aside for the purpose of this. But I mean, how the SNP, Labour, Plaid, Green Party, how can we get them working together to deliver this?
Yeah, the other $1 million question. And it is hard. So I agree with you. Back to the question about theory of change, one of the things that we've been thinking quite hard about is to what extent will we get the change that we need by, if you like, mobilizing movements and the kind of groundswell of popular support that puts pressure on the government, and to what extent are we trying to get opposition parties to work together to put pressure on government. I think there is some collaboration amongst opposition parties, but it doesn't feel anything like the scale that we need at the moment. And so we are putting our money in popular pressure, probably being able to shift the dial quicker. But I would hope that in this moment, there is a recognition across the leaders of all of our opposition parties that this is the time to unite, and there is an ability to think about the set of core things that need to be pushed for, because actually there's not that much that divides them, and actually there's more common ground than there is points of differences. The question is whether you can have a tactical and strategic conversation that says, these are the things, we think that this is a pressure point, these are the things that we should be pushing for in a coordinated way, in order to drive the shifts that we need to. I don't think we're there yet in our politics, but I think we are about to, if you like, up to now, the crisis has been about the public health crisis, rightly so. You know, I think all parties have been trying to combine the need to be kind of constructive and supportive where they can versus where they push the government. I think as we move into the economic crisis, which for me will start to really bite from the autumn, and if the government unwinds the furlough scheme in the way that it's planning to, it's going to bite in a pretty grave and hard way. I think from there, the story of the economics will be dominating. And already, you know, the stats that are coming, 3 million families going without a meal through lockdown, an 81% increase use in food banks in March, since March of last year. I mean, this is profound and terrifying. And I think when the politics of that starts kicking through, I hope that's a wake-up call for those on the progressive side, and that's not just opposition parties, because there are many progressives within the Conservative Party as well, to think about how they get a grip and what are the things that they need to apply pressure on the government to do, because the times demands it, but also if they don't get it right, I mean, I think the political backlash against the entire political system is going to be absolutely profound.
Okay, next question, Stephen Pittam.
Great, yes. Yeah, can you hear me? Yes, that's...
Yeah, perfect.
Great, good, great. Hi, Miatta, and thanks very much. I've always enjoyed listening to you on various things. And I'm really interested in the radical past of NEF, remembering that it was started, I think, it came out of the Other Economic Summit, which is some time ago now. But it always seems to me to have been kind of on the outside track, thinking about the visionary ideas. And I just wondered, you know, thinking about local banks and things like that. And I just wondered whether you could comment on what are the, you know, the building blocks of a new economy from NEF's point of view at this point in time. And to what extent do you think it's important to work on the outside in terms of visionary ideas, or to engage with the mainstream? And can you do both?
Brilliant question. So if you'd asked me this question 6 years ago, I would have said probably not. And I would have said that actually it was right for us to be an outrider, and the mainstream would catch up in 10 years' time. I think the mainstream is and has caught up in terms of the problem analysis. You know, I think the fact that it doesn't matter where you are on the political spectrum, people are saying the economy doesn't work. I think the fact that ideas that for a long time felt like radical ideas are actually not that radical anymore suggests that actually the discourse in our politics has really, really shifted because of the times. And if that was true before this crisis, it's true now. So for me, I think the job that we have, because we've got the conditions for quite profound change, is to occupy that space. I think it would be an absolute mistake if an organization like NEF, which is about big systemic change, didn't use a big systemic moment to drive that change. If we were there imagining a world in 100 years' time rather than the world that we have, that we can fundamentally change. And so, you know, that feels right. I think these moments come rarely in our history. I think there are pivot points where we can have a genuine paradigm shift, and I think we are in one. I think it started, quite frankly, in 2008, in the way that the Great Depression created the way for the post-war consensus. I think that's the space that we're in. So we've got to grip that. We've got to occupy it. We've got to think about, you know, we've got the toolkit of the big ideas. We always have done, you know, but the question is, how do we get from where we are to that? That's the challenge before us. And if we miss the window, I think we miss a big moment to try and shift the dial and to achieve the very thing that we want to. In terms of the kind of building blocks for the new economy, I think for us, there are, you know, 6 key things that are fundamental to trying to get the new economy. I think the first is trying to get an economy that works within environmental limits. And for me, that is paramount. And if it wasn't paramount before, it absolutely is, because the clock is ticking on the impact of climate and ecological crisis. So that has got to be the priority. And how you begin to reconfigure the economy so it does that. Is hard. We've got some of the answers, but we've got a long way to go to think about what a kind of a radical reform agenda looks like to lock that in. I think the second building block for me is an economy which essentially drives you know, improvements and equalization of living standards. I think that has got to be the core of a new economy, and part of that is, you know, the shift from an economy that only cares about growth at the expense of anything else to an economy that fundamentally is thinking about things like well-being. And why I think that is so salient now is, you know, for a long time, you could argue that where we had growth, it resulted in improvements in living standards, granted in the margins, but it resulted in improvements in living standards. In the last 10 years, that link has broken down. So no more can people tell you, let's just grow the economy, it'll all be fine. Well, we grew the economy, and yet living standards didn't shift, which means that if you want to address living standards, you've got to get to the issue of well-being. And it feels like there's a moment now that we can do that in a way that was harder before. And then for me, the other kind of core planks of it is progressive business. You know, I think in the end, business has a key part in the economy, and I think it is both a combination of how we diversify our business space, thinking about other forms of enterprise, cooperative enterprises, community social enterprises, as well as how we ensure that traditional businesses have social responsibility and social purpose baked into the business model. That is hard graft, but that has to be part of the project. And then the other 2 things is, for me, a state that does work in a way that is trying to drive social and environmental outcomes in the economy, but a decentralized, localized state. So this comes back to the kind of devolution agenda. And then an empowering agenda. So in the end, it has to be about people and having power and agency and control over the economy. And part of that will be in how they participate through democratic processes, but also part of that is how they have ownership. You know, so, you know, a big strand for us is how we democratize the economy, you know, how we hand power over to people, whether they are in the forms of, you know, collective ownership that you'd imagine through kind of public ownership, through to cooperative and community ownership being a really important part of how we start to reconfigure the way the economy works.
Okay, thanks. Next question from Mary McCullum. And I'll read her question out loud, and she just asks, could an independent Scotland encourage or even force the absolute imperative for electoral reform?
Minefield.
Right.
So it can do, you know. My husband's Scottish, so we often have the debate about independence with his family. From a progressive point of view, I think Scotland going independent would be a massive blow to the progressive cause. You know, the roots of our progressive politics are located in Scotland. Lots of our progressive leaders over the years have come from Scotland. There is a part of the Scottish political DNA that has always been more progressive and radical than, in some respects, the DNA in England. And I think our ability to, you know, win change, win power, I think is hugely constrained by an independent Scotland. I think it'd probably be brilliant for the Scots. They can move into a sort of independent, social democratic. I think the stuff that Sturgeon is doing is, great in many respects. There are lots of our agenda that she's picked up. I think there's a cadre of leaders, herself, Jacinda, that are exciting and are thinking about new things. But I think for the UK as a whole, it would be a massive blow. I think for progressive politics and progressive change in the UK as a whole, it would be a massive blow. So I hope the debate about independence forces questions about our political system and our electoral system. But I think if the outcome and the polls are, they're shifting in favour of independence, and I suspect going through the crisis that we are, it will harden. But I think if the outcome is independence, that would be genuinely sad.
Okay. Okay, probably the last question we'll have time for from Jasmine, who had a question about climate change.
Thank you. That's a really great talk. Really enjoyed it. Yeah, my question is that even if we have this common sense baseline locked in that you mentioned, is there still a risk with the clock ticking on climate change, that the changes are not significant enough, not fast enough? And if yes, how can we speed up the progress on this issue?
Yeah, excellent question. And if there's a thing that keeps me up at night, it's that even though there has been a shift in our politics, and actually the work of the Youth Strikers, Extinction Rebellion, many others, has massively accelerated public awareness of the climate and ecological crisis and the need for urgency, I still don't think we're quite there. And I think that 2050 and trying to move at that, like even that is too slow. So the urgency that we need at every level of our political international system for the thing that is coming is in parts of the world already there, inviting in such a profound way. I just don't think is there. And I think that's really scary, because what will happen is that we will sort of dawdle for a little bit longer, and then we will be in crisis point and firefighting. Where I am a bit more hopeful is, I think one of the things that the pandemic, I hope, will do is focus the minds, because one of the lessons from the pandemic was the fact that, the scientists told us a pandemic would be coming, and we weren't prepared, and we didn't take it seriously, and we didn't do the things that we needed to. And we are paying the price. And I think for those of us that have been arguing for the need for radical change in response to climate, we often say it's unprecedented, it's going to change everything. I think that was quite hard for people to grasp. I don't think people actually believed it. And we're just going through something, which is a natural crisis, if you like, that is fundamentally changing everything before our eyes. So the arguments that you can have these things and they will rip up everything, and we've got to prepare for them, I think is something that will gain traction now in a way that was harder before, and we've got to capitalize on that. And I suspect what we're about to see over the course of the next 2 years is we were already seeing the symptoms of climate change biting in a more visceral way. The floods here, the Amazon fires, there were all these visible examples of, my God, this thing is here and it's happening. That's now going to intersect with a grave economic crisis, the deepest crisis for 300 years, a depression probably, where there is, genuine hardship, not just in this country, but across the world. And I think it's that intersection that will give an urgency, because it will be the combination of the flood, the fire will be so much worse because our resilience to deal with it when we are tackling an economic crisis will be that much weaker. The impact on it on people's lives will feel so much worse because the baseline was already terrible, because people were unemployed, people were on the breadline. So all of that, which is scary and terrifying, I think will have to focus the minds. And that sense of, we cannot afford to have, it's going to take us 10 years to fully build back from this crisis. We can't afford more shocks that will throw everything up. And it's that thing that I think will create urgency. We're not there yet, but I think in the next couple of years, we will get there.
Brilliant, great questions. As ever, thank you so much for them. So just before we let you go and put the twins to bed, Miatta, you always seem like a hopeful, optimistic person. Where does that come from? What do you see in the world around you, whether that's the think tank world or whether that's your community, or wherever, that gives you hope? Why can we get out of this, and what are the pointers to suggest that we can do this? What keeps you going?
I think for me is that people. I think there are two things. I think people are intrinsically good. People are intrinsically well-meaning, and I sort of combine that with the fact that in the end, I think that the impossible can be done. It is a question of political will. It's a question of collective will, collective endeavor. We have these moments that feel terrifying and awful and impossible, and we do impossible things all the time. And I think that combination of believing that, fundamentally people, it doesn't matter where you are in your politics, it doesn't matter where you are across the political spectrum, are intrinsically good. There are the few exceptions, but on the broad whole, they're intrinsically good, with our ability to rise to challenges when we need to. That's the thing that gives me optimism. And on our politics, I think there's a lot that you can feel quite despondent about. But most politicians, it kind of doesn't matter where they are on the spectrum. They go into it because they generally want to do public good. They might have different views of how they do it. They might have different values that drive it, but they are generally trying to do good. I think if you can harness that and you can get to a point where we have kind of collective pressure and collective awareness of what needs to be done, anything is possible. And in the despair at the moment, I think is huge hope, because I think the window for profound change is absolutely there and it's gaping open, and we have got to seize it.
Fabulous. You're getting lots of plaudits in the chat thing. People want to know more about you and NEF, which is great, and so you should do. It's been a joy talking to you tonight. It's been a joy working with you on Build Back Better as well, Miatta. And thank you so much for coming on, and thank you for our members and everyone else who's joined the call tonight. It's been another great discussion. Next week, we kind of, at least to some degree, get out of London, as we'll be joined by Andy Burnham, the Mayor of Manchester, for what I'm sure will be another great conversation. Until then, thanks again, Miatta. Thanks all of you. Keep safe, keep well, and as Miatta says, keep hopeful. Take care. So, if you like what you've heard today and want to be part of a much more equal, democratic and sustainable future, a good society, then visit us at compassonline.org.uk/podcast, and you'll be able to join us live on future calls just like this one. You can tweet me at Neil, NEAL_Compass, or Compass at Compass Office. And if you've enjoyed this week's episode, please give us a rating. It will help us reach more listeners in the future. And it's only fair that they know it's bloody complicated too.